Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a very important webinar that you've joined, and I hope that it's useful. I'm absolutely delighted to have Joanna Millar from Gilson Gray here with us today, who's going to be able to answer some technical questions on the legalities of the proposed licensing scheme from the Scottish Government. Melanie Allen is our comms genius, and she's here. She's going to be collating some questions. If you've got any questions, just go into the chat at the bottom of the screen and just type them in there, and Mel can liaise with those later on if anybody has anything that they want to talk about. I will pass over to Jo in a short while, but I thought I'd better set the scene just in the interim. So forgive me if you know all of this, but just to set the scene, the Scottish Government are currently consulting on the detail of their short-term let regulations. The consultation covers three main points: the definition of short-term lets, the establishment of control areas under the Planning Act, and the creation of licensing under the Civic Government Act of 1982. Luckily, the bonus is that the tax treatment of short-term lets is going to be dealt with separately, and they've put that on a slight pause at the moment, which is good news. Scottish Government maintain that their proposals are fair, robust and proportionate, and balance the needs of local communities, tourism and operators. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that statement, but that's what they're proposing. They argue that the previous consultation, which took place in 2019, illustrated, quote, broad support for regulation from stakeholders, unquote. That's because they spoke to 592 affected residents, 63 community organisations, a few Airbnb hosts, and 5 professional self-catering operators, plus me. And I had to fight for them to talk to those 5 people. You can find a briefing on the consultation, this consultation, on the ASSC website, which essentially condenses a 54-page Scottish Government document into a slightly more manageable 6 pages. The SSC has also provided members with some bullet points to help them respond to the consultation. But what's really important is that you shape your consultation response personally. So it's not just copying and pasting what we've suggested. It has to be your response. You should reference specific points in the consultation document, including paragraph numbers, points which you think are unworkable, impractical. They might burden you as a self-catering operator. It's your consultation response, but it's really important that your voice is heard. Do add in as much personal detail as you want about how the regulations may negatively impact your business, or indeed your local community or the supply chain. You can also reference, if you feel like it, or if you support them, the ASSC's 2 policy papers, Forward Together, a collaborative approach to short-term letting and licensing or registration for short-term lets in Scotland. They're both on the ASSC website under the policy page. We believe that the SSC has provided a proportionate, evidence-based and indeed future-proofed solution for national and local government in Scotland in terms of short-term regulation, but we just need them to listen to our proposals. They don't seem to be listening, and I think Jo will probably tell you it's far too late and they're not going to change their minds, but I'm just going to tell you what we believe and see if you agree with them. We believe that any licensing system should have clear frameworks and national guidance from the Scottish Government, should be instant, low cost and online, should automatically renew annually, and finally, it should definitely distinguish between professional and non-professional activity. So if we go into a little bit of detail, the definition of short-term lets. The first question, there's only 3 questions in the consultation. The first one asks about the proposed definition of short-term lets. This is discussed in chapter 4 of the consultation War and Peace Bible. If there are any issues with the proposed definition and how these should be resolved. So what are the issues? We believe that the Scottish Government need to properly define what's meant by a short-term let, as this obviously underpins all the elements of the regulatory framework. We believe that the definitions currently provided are inadequate, misleading, and impossible to enforce. Fundamentally, the document makes reference constantly to hosts. Now, that's a term typically used by one particular accommodation platform, our friends at Airbnb. We don't believe that this accurately reflects what professional operators do. I personally do not identify as a host. I identify as an owner or an operator. If the main policy drivers behind this legislation are to inform local authorities on the extent of short-term let activity and to enforce health and safety, which is what they say they are, then we believe that hotels and B&Bs with self-catering associated with them and student halls that are used for short-term letting out with term time should be included in the definition. And so should what they call unconventional dwellings, so pods, caravans, canal boats even. So what's the solution here? We believe that we need a definition of who delivers the accommodation and what the accommodation is before we can make sure that it adequately addresses the policy objectives. The second question asks to identify any issues with the proposed control area regulations. This is in chapter 5 and asks how these could be resolved. See, they're asking for suggestions, which is nice. Clearly, we're really worried that certain local authorities, Edinburgh, would use this legislation to back up a de facto ban of short-term lets and tenement properties. We know that they're going to do this. They've said it. They said it as recently as last week. The second point is that secondary letting isn't a use class order. So I'd say that we're fairly confused as to why you would need to get a change of use planning permission to secondary letting, which doesn't exist. Another real worry is the 10-year revocation threat. If a business has received planning permission and is operating under that use class order, it's totally unfair and disproportionate for people to live under the threat of revocation and uncertainty of whether or not they would gain planning renewal after 10 years. So what's our solution here? We believe we provided the proportionate evidence-based approach, and they should listen to our approach. Our approach is backed up by facts and evidence. Short-term let areas should be clearly defined at a national level by the Scottish Government. They should be proportionate. They should not be discriminatory. They should be in line with EU services directives. They should be evidence-based, and they should be reviewed on an annual basis. So the third and final question asks about issues with the proposed licensing scheme. That's in chapter 6. So what are the issues? We are totally in favour of amateurs having to reach the same health and safety standards that we reach to ensure a level playing field. However, a licensing scheme as the one proposed seems to be an utterly disproportionate and heavy-handed approach. It's a very, very blunt tool to fix a perceived and localised problem of amateur operators in Edinburgh, rather than being a solution appropriate for the whole of Scotland. We're already heavily regulated. I don't need to tell you that. Licensing is going to be incredibly burdensome to operators who are already under severe financial pressure over the impact of COVID-19. We also have a problem with the lack of clear direction being given to local authorities by these proposed regulations. It may well result in inconsistent implementation and compliance across the 32 local authorities. Due to the impact of COVID-19, the potential shortcomings of this licensing scheme come into really sharp focus. Firstly, local authorities are already stretched in terms of resources, and having to deal with an influx of potentially tens of thousands of licensing applications will bring them to their knees. And secondly, the potential impact of a disproportionate licensing system could have a really serious impact on the recovery of Scottish tourism. This shouldn't be underestimated. Meanwhile, and somewhat critically, despite the financial impact to operators, businesses, tourism and local authorities, no business regulatory impact assessment has been published to accompany proposals. Now, this is contrary to Scottish Government guidance. So what's our solution? And Joe will tell me we can't. Scrap the proposals and adopt the ASSC proposal of a registration scheme with mandatory health and safety compliance. They can call it a licensing scheme. It's all in the semantics, but it would not require authorization. And the authorization part is the very critical part here. It's a very different matter. Fees. What do we know about the fees? The Scottish Government is saying that local authorities should be able to recover the costs of any monitoring and enforcement work they undertake. The overall revenue from all fees should cover all establishment and running costs of the scheme. Now that's terrifying in the first instance, isn't it? They haven't given us any indication of what that looks like. And there's a critical word here, monitoring fees. The Scottish Government would like local authorities to be able to collect fees either on renewal or as a subscription. they are able to monitor you throughout the year. So you would have an application fee, licensing fee, and then a monitoring fee. So what are we looking at in terms of timeline? The consultation runs until Friday, so it's a very, very tight schedule. The Scottish Government note that this was a shorter period of engagement than was originally intended, but this was due to the delay caused by COVID-19. So they are consulting over 4 weeks instead of the customary 12. The legislation is due to be laid in December 2020, and the regulations will come into force on the 1st of April 2021. There are some transitional arrangements set up, and we are looking at all hosts having to have a licence by the 31st of March 2024. So the Scottish Government will say to us, we're not expecting you to do anything now, but the fundamental problem is we will be expected to do something soon, and we need to make sure that this legislation is fit for purpose well before March 2024. Many of you, and there are over 150 people on the call today, so thank you very much indeed, will have carried out our survey recently. 1,184 responses in 5 days. Now this compares to the 2019 consultation from the Scottish Government. They got 1,086 in 12 weeks, just saying. So thank you to all the people that took part in our survey. Unfortunately, the survey results are pretty torrid reading. 95% of respondents believe that this legislation should be delayed while the sector recovers from COVID-19. Similar, 95% believe that it requires greater parliamentary scrutiny. This is being pushed through as an SSI and not getting parliamentary scrutiny. 83% are not supportive of this licensing scheme. Indeed, 31% of businesses would be rendered unviable if the proposals for this licensing scheme were introduced. And 64% felt it would have a negative impact on their guests. 49% would leave the self-catering sector. Now that is a terrifying figure. We're a sector that represents £723 million to the Scottish economy. If 49% of those people leave the sector, what's the unintended consequence of the supply chain and the local economies? 89% would be supportive of a simple online registration scheme as proposed by the ASSC. So, the coronavirus pandemic is the single biggest national emergency faced by Scotland since 1945. We have no idea what Brexit's going to do to the Scottish economy. The timescale and limitations of this consultation, in my opinion, represent an abuse of the process. They are already strongly suggesting that no changes are being made, and meaningful consideration of any feedback is unlikely, but we've got to do what we can. I know this is a really busy and really stressful time for everybody involved in our industry, but it's really important that as many self-catering operators as possible respond to the consultation by Friday to ensure that the voice of our business stakeholders is heard. It really is our final chance to influence and shape the regulations. And I know that we're asking an awful lot of you, but we also really need you to write to your MSPs. Copy in the Cabinet Minister for Rural Economy and Tourism, Fergus Ewing. Copy in the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Kate Forbes. This is our last chance and we need to make this impact known. On our Autumn Talks webinar a couple of weeks ago with Fergus Ewing, he said that he was willing to make further representations to colleagues on the timescale for implementation of this legislation and wanted to listen to concerns. He said, "It is my job to put forward reasonable arguments." We've got an invitation. Let's take him up on this invitation. So I'm going to stop terrifying you, and I'd like to welcome Joanna Millar, Legal Director at Gilson Gray. Gilson Gray are our new and incredibly valued partner for business, and we're delighted to be supported by this award-winning legal firm. Jo is going to give you some legal detail, and then we'll both take questions. Jo, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So it's my turn to terrify you now. Sorry, if you thought I was going to be any better than Fiona, I'm afraid I'm probably not. So as they say in a popular hair care advert, let's get the science bit out the way. The issue here, as Fiona said, is this has been brought in by a statutory instrument. Now, simply put, what that means is when you bring in new law, normally there is what you call a bill. So there's either a private member's bill, which an MSP will draft and put forward, or the government decides it needs new law for something and it brings in a bill. And that bill will then be put before Parliament in its draft form. And before that, there will be consultation, there will be the BRIA, which we don't have here, and there will be a great deal of consideration. It will then go to bill stage and it will go through various parliamentary stages before it becomes what we call an act. And an act of Parliament, whether that's Scottish Government or Westminster, is just that. It is legislation which comes into force. So the difficulty we have here is we are not going through that process. What we are proposing to do here is amend existing legislation. So the Scottish Government has taken the Civic Government Scotland Act 1982, and it is already a licensing act. I know it doesn't really sound like it, but it is a licensing act. It doesn't govern any form of liquor. It governs all of your general, what we call general licensing. So everything from metal dealers, second-hand dealers, waiters, catering licenses, public entertainment licenses, market operators licenses, to boating licenses. So a whole variety of licenses. So what the Scottish Government is doing is slotting in the licensing scheme that they have decided is going to be put in place for yourselves for short-term lets, and that is going to be slotted into this existing piece of legislation. Now, that means that what the Scottish Government is effectively doing is amending a current piece of legislation. So it's not a new piece of legislation, it's an existing piece, and we're amending it. There are some advantages to that. I know there's not many advantages to this whole system, but if we have to have a licensing system, then the advantages are there is already a general section of the 1982 Act. And that section governs how applications are made, how you object to applications, how the applications are processed and considered. And they're considered at a licensing committee, not a licensing board. So the board considers alcohol, betting and gaming, and the committee considers general licensing. It also considers HMO licenses. So the committee is already set up, which again is an advantage because the infrastructure for that committee is there. We're not doing it from scratch. You're not having to go along with councillors who have never sat on a committee before and don't know what they're doing. So there are some advantages of putting it into an existing piece of legislation. And in theory, the consultation should not be any less. The problem we have here is the excuse used is due to coronavirus, there was delays. And now the Scottish Government is insisting it has to lay the draft legislation before Parliament before all the Brexit legislation hits. So what it has said is the way that you amend existing legislation is by what is called a statutory instrument. And as this is a Scottish matter, it's a Scottish statutory instrument. So it's called an SSI. So the SSI will be drafted, that will be very legal speak, and that will amend the existing 82 Act to slot in your new short-term let licensing scheme. And that will go before Parliament as a draft in December 2020. I don't think there is any way you're going to avoid this now. They've made their announcement, and I think as soon as the announcement was made, that was the death knell for any regulation scheme. I don't think the Scottish Government is now going to back off a licensing scheme. There may be prospect to delay it, but realistically, I think you're going to end up with a scheme at some point. That said, do what Fiona says, write to your MSPs, write to Fergus Ewing. All of these people have said, we'll help, we'll delay, we'll take into account what you're saying. So hold them to that and do get in touch with them. So the progress, as I think it will go, because I don't think it will be delayed, I think they've now got the freight train going and I'm not sure that they can stop it, will be the legislation will go before Parliament. They have a very short time scale of having that in a final form by 1st April 2021, which is when it should come into force. After that date, there will then be a period of a year for licensing boards to put their scheme in place. So they will have until 31st March 2022. Once the scheme is in place, all of you who need licenses will have a year to apply. So you will have from 1st April 22 to 31st March 2023. The committees, the licensing sections at each council, will then have until 31st March 2024 to consider applications. So normally they have 6 months, but this initial period of transition will be extended to a year. So you will be able to operate, if you're a current operator, you will be able to operate during that period. They are talking about bringing in a cut-off. So obviously after 31st March 2023, when you are still able to operate, but your application is in and being considered, there is discussion that they will not be taking any new applications, only transitional applications. So that's one of the things Fiona and I need to be really clear with them on, because we can't end up in a position where if you are a new operator, you cannot trade because you cannot get your application in for your license. So there needs to be the facility to lodge new applications during that period, as well as transitional applications from existing operators. We also have the fee proposal, and the fee proposal comes from the self-funding aspect of this. And I see there's a question already saying, can you tell me where the figure of £1,000 per licence comes from? The difficulty is that we do not know what self-funding will mean. So as an example, the liquor licensing, the alcohol licensing regime completely changed in 2009. So it was a Licensing Act 2005. It took them 4 years to get it right and get it into force. So we're hoping to do it in 4 months with this one. So it's a little bit hopeful, but we're going to be left with the fallout of that. The whole point of the liquor licensing was that the council departments that dealt with liquor licensing needed to be self-funding. So they had to consider what element of their provision was general licensing, our public entertainments, our boating lakes, and what element was alcohol licensing. Then they had to establish how to self-fund that. So they fixed fees. The fees for alcohol licenses range between £800 and £2,000, and they're based on your annual rateable value. Obviously, you don't have that, so we don't know how they're going to fix the fees in terms of if they're going to be staggered based on perhaps the band rates for council tax, and whether they will then make certain council tax band rates equivalent to certain rateable value rates. So the rateable values have been divided into bands for the purpose of the Licensing Act. To establish what band you fall into means you'll have to pay a certain amount. In terms of normal general license application fees, so if you're looking at an application for a letters catering license or a public entertainment license, unless you're applying for Tea in the Park as it was, or Transmit as it is now, then your license fee will be about £300 or £400 a year. So the reason we went for 1,000 in the questionnaire was because it was an easy round figure. We thought it probably reflected closer to the liquor licensing fees, but we are hopeful that the Scottish Government, that all of the councils will fix the fees based on their self-funding aspect of this, and this being a very small part, much smaller than alcohol licensing, that your fees will then be significantly lower than alcohol. So we're hoping it won't be £1,000, but we don't know. And the other issue is, as one lady said on a previous ASSC call, if you have multiple properties, then we don't know how that will work. Now, if you have multiple properties across different councils or even in totally different parts of a village or a town, you are going to most likely have to pay for each one. And I doubt there'll be concessions for second properties, but it's something to think about in the submission. If you have a site, for example, with properties on that site, so if you have lodges and you have, they come within the definition and you're going to have to license them. One lady said she had 22 lodges on the one site, and for her to have to license all of them, is that fair, is that not? Is she then getting advantage of each one? Is that comparable? So there's all sorts of questions as to how the fees should work, if it's on area, if it's on council tax, and if every single one of a group should then have to pay a fee, or if they can be grouped together in a geographical area. So that's the issue of the application fee, sorry. You've then got what they refer to as the monitoring fee. Now, there isn't an annual fee for any other general license, but there is in liquor licensing. So what we're looking at here is almost some kind of fee where you pay it annually, and it's equivalent to a renewal in liquor licensing because you don't have to renew. The difficulty is, under the general licensing scheme of the 1982 Act, you will have to renew. Your licence will come up for renewal in general every 3 years. That's the position at present. So again, in the submission, we should be saying there shouldn't be a monitoring fee. And I know that in the submission, the consultation documentation, there was reference to you wouldn't be charged for a first inspection, but if there was additional inspections, you would be charged. Never heard of that before. Doesn't matter how many times the HMO department come out, doesn't matter how many times Environmental Services come out for an application under the 82 Act, people are not charged for the council to come and do visits. So I don't know if this is something the Scottish Government have plucked out the air, but this is definitely something that we will be addressing in the consultation response on your behalf to say there shouldn't be charges. Fair enough, if you have to get an electrical test certificate or something that is privately done, then your charges are whatever they are. But if it's a council matter, there shouldn't be charges. So again, there's quite a few things need ironed out here. There's also the planning controls, and that's a really big issue. I know a lot of you are concerned about planning control areas, and I have to say some boards have already said they're unlikely to put that into place. So I think if you don't live in Edinburgh, or perhaps Edinburgh or Glasgow, then it may not be such an issue, or you don't have property there, it may not be such an issue. What is an issue is this 10-year renewal. Now, your planning permission should be in place. It shouldn't be renewed every 10 years. If you make a change, then it should be your responsibility to do the application for that change. And if you don't do that application and a planning officer comes round and sees that you've not done the application, then you get served with a notice. And that's the way planning works at present, and it works perfectly well. Conservation zones, for example, if people do not put in the proper type of sash windows, or they try and use PVC equivalents, and a planning officer happens to see it, or somebody happens to see it, they'll be reported, they'll be told to take it out, and they'll be told to fix it. There's a real inconsistency with having something for 10 years, and I don't see how you can have a business of your type that is being asked every 10 years to consider if it's going to have a planning problem. And I know that will affect probably practically a small percentage of you, but I think it's the fact it's the Damocles sword hanging over you, which is of no use and no help to an industry already suffering. So that's another thing that Fiona and I will address in the consultation response. You've also got the issue of mandatory conditions. Now, we already have mandatory conditions for alcohol licenses, and they actually work very well. They cannot be changed. Each licence has to abide by them. For example, you'll all remember when minimum pricing came in, well, that became a mandatory condition. So the mandatory conditions were amended, and everybody who had a liquor licence had to comply. The mandatory conditions here are not taking that form. They are interpretative, which means they are not mandatory, because every board can interpret them differently. And again, that's something we need to address in the consultation, is that if they're mandatory conditions, they need to be set in stone, they need to be fixed, and the guidance to boards, or to committees rather, needs to be clear. If they are going to have the ability to put on local conditions, that's fine. But again, the Scottish Government guidance causes me concern, because I've seen the guidance that came out at the beginning for alcohol, and it wasn't clear, and it's not been kept up to date. So I'm hoping that when the guidance comes out, we did speak to Andrew when he was on a call, the representative from the Scottish Government group, which is very involved in drafting this, and we made the point that we were hoping they would allow us to see the guidance. So I'm hoping that we get to see the guidance, and if we do, that we get to comment on the guidance, because having local conditions can be very onerous, and it may be that you don't have property in Edinburgh and Glasgow, but when it comes to liquor licensing, for example, the Western Isles conditions can be much worse than the major cities. So it's not a case of considering because people don't live in cities, they're going to have an easier time. That's not necessarily the case. And I think that's the wrong perception that perhaps is coming from the Scottish Government. There are also issues with the consultation where the Scottish Government team who put it together simply do not understand the existing legislation. I know that doesn't sound terribly encouraging. Fiona and I were not encouraged in our call with them, unfortunately. they're talking about using things like a joint notice for planning and licensing. Now, that is not going to work if they are going to use the current legislation. The current legislation already has in place guidance on how you do the notices and how you object. And one of the things we need to make very, very clear in the consultation response is that the current 1982 Act system works perfectly well. It's been around since 1982, so it's been around for nearly 40 years. Pardon me, it works perfectly well. The people who deal with it on a day-to-day basis within the councils understand it. The councillors who sit on the committee understand it. Everybody is now clear. There's nearly 40 years of legislation and case law. Now, case law is when the legislation isn't clear and it has to be interpreted by the court. So there's all sorts of cases from the 1982 Act, and they're not all specific to different types of licenses. Some of them are about the way committees deal with applications. Some of them are about the notice period. It's 28 days. Is it what we call 28 clear days, which means it has to be 28 full days, or is it just 28 days? The answer is it's 28 clear days. But we know that because we've worked through nearly 40 years of case law and interpretation of this Act. The Scottish Government are now proposing within this new introduction of legislation to amend those sections, and that's just going to make a mess. So one of the things we need to say to them is, this is what the current procedures are for lodging applications, considering applications, objecting to applications. You need to just leave them alone. If planning is a consideration, you have a perfectly robust planning regime in place. People can object to planning. Leave it alone. So that's one of the messages that we need to give them, is everybody needs to stay in their lane. Planning needs to stay in its lane, licensing needs to stay in its lane, and everyone needs to use the legislation and the procedures they currently have. Otherwise, it's going to get very messy and very confusing for everyone. This should be a regime where you can apply yourself. There should be an opportunity to do it online or by a written form. There should be a fairly straightforward method of applying and uploading additional documentation. One of the things which the Scottish Government team keeps saying is it's not onerous. It's not onerous. The ASSC keeps saying this is onerous, and they keep saying it's not onerous. Why is it onerous? And that's one of the things we need to really bring home to them, is it is onerous. At the moment, you don't have to go through a licensing regime. At the moment, you don't have to understand what mandatory conditions and local conditions are. You don't have to pay an application fee. You don't have to pay a renewal fee or go through a renewal process. What happens if you forget to renew? At the moment, under the 1982 Act, if you forget to renew by your renewal date, your licence falls and you need to apply of new for a new licence. Now, what that means is you cannot do whatever it is you were doing under your licence. So if you were a second-hand dealer, you can't sell second-hand goods for that period because you forgot to renew your licence. In a topsy-turvy world as we're in at the moment, and under the pressure you're all under, I'm sure diarying yet another thing to remember to renew every 3 years is not what you need. So the problem with fitting it into the 82 Act is that's how that works, and they need to determine whether they are going to therefore do that, or whether they are going to go down the liquor route, which is no renewals but an annual fee. So that as well needs to be clear, and it's not clear from the consultation. The other question of onerous is all of these things you need to comply with. Fiona has obviously managed in the past to achieve for you that you do not have to meet the repairing standards. That is a really big issue because the consultation refers to repairing standards. The other issue is that the consultation refers to certain certification, which at the moment you do not need to get. Now, for an HMO licence, for example, you have to have your electricity, your test certificate done every year, and you have to produce that every single year. So perhaps you were doing it every 3 years or every 5 years at the moment. You would have to then do it every year if that's going to come in. And if you look at the consultation and look at the proposed mandatory conditions, this is where I'm saying some of them are open to interpretation. So the amount of paperwork which I think you'll have to get is much more significant than you do at the moment. And a lot of these conditions are going to be open to different councils to determine. So you might find that if you have a property, for example, in Argyll and Bute, and one in Highland, and one in Perth, you might have a whole set of different compliances. So you might have a whole set of different conditions because Perth insist on you doing one thing, whereas Highlands insist on you doing another. And that is the inconsistency, and that's where it becomes onerous. So the initial cost is onerous, the requirement to renew is onerous, the requirement to do the application in the first place for people who are perhaps not confident about being online or have terrible Wi-Fi. Fiona was saying there's members who their Wi-Fi just won't support them filling in a form online. People don't like filling in paper forms. And if you are required to get all of these certificates, then you have to pay someone to get them for you. You can't just produce a fire certificate because you think it complies. So there is the danger that you are going to have a lot more to comply with and a lot more cost on you. So it's mainly the question of how is this onerous is something which is really important to get across to the Scottish Government, because they don't accept it and they don't believe it. So if you are going to do your own response to the consultation, I would be saying to them that it is onerous and explaining why. And I know the majority of that is cost. That's okay. A lot of these things you don't have to do at the moment. So I would definitely be saying that it is onerous, but they won't accept just saying it's onerous because we've tried that. They want the detail. So that's one of the things we'll be doing in our response, but we also need you as members to do it in your response. So, okay, you probably heard enough from me now. I'm probably scarier than Fiona, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, I kind of feel like you won there. So I think it's fairly clear why we need your support in filling in some consultation forms. We cannot let this licensing scheme be led by the disgruntled vocal few in Edinburgh, which is what's happening at the moment. Right now, we need the voices of professional self-catering operators that it is going to impact hugely to say how it's going to impact us. And that the critical, so the two critical things, and we're really asking you to do this, and I'm apologise in advance, we really need you to fill in your own consultation response. And as I say, there are some bullet points in the ASSC website in the members area. It's got to look like it's not a campaign. It's got to be personalised by your own response. And the second thing is we really need you to write to your MSPs, because they do not know this is happening. They do not know what the potential impact is going to be. You know, so if you write to your MSP and copy Fergus Ewing, Kate Forbes, Kevin Stewart, then you need to say, are you aware that this is happening? Why is it happening now when everything else has been shelved? Transient visitor levy discussions have been totally shelved. Why is this being pushed through so severely now? Why the impact's going to be devastating? And what are the reasons for that? Is it going to be economic? Is it going to be administratively burdensome? All of those things. And, you know, you've got to remember also that this has got all sorts of little different agendas going on here. It's being led by the housing department. This is not being led by the tourism department. And that says an awful lot about what they're trying to achieve here. This is, in a sense, trying to address concerns about housing stock. Well, that is not what this is going to do. It is fundamentally not going to do that. And it's fundamentally an unfair conversation. They need to look to local authority planning and housing policy to see why there isn't enough housing stock, to see why there isn't enough affordable housing. Getting 49% of self-caterers to exit the self-catering industry is not going to put those properties back onto the market. 33% of those 49% have said that if they exit the sector, reducing the capacity, they will just leave those properties lying empty or use them for family and friends. What's the point in that? So you've got to remember who this is being led by, which is why Kevin Stewart is another person that you should be contacting. So yeah, that's the worry, and apologies for frightening the living daylights out of you, especially at this time of all times, but it's really desperately important that this is taken seriously and we're not just thrown under the bus any more than we have been during this COVID crisis. Mel, are there any sort of pressing questions that you can see?
Yes, so we've got some questions coming through. So one of the first questions from Siobhan: what areas are likely to be control areas?
Well, this is the big worry, is Edinburgh. City of Edinburgh Council has been leading on this for a good number of years, and they have said that as soon as the legislation comes in, they will slap a control zone over the whole of Edinburgh, which is completely preposterous and disproportionate. If they, and this is why we're saying that the Scottish Government needs to be really quite strong in where people are allowed to set up control zones. If there's a problem in EH1, then control that problem in EH1. Don't slap this ban over the whole of Edinburgh. So, and the reason behind our proposed scheme of a registration scheme with mandatory health and safety is that that would give local authorities real-time evidence of what the properties are being used for. And therefore, you then identify if there's a problem. Now, if there's a problem, bring in a license, fine. But don't bring in a license to find out if there's a problem. It's like cart and horse. You know, they're not thinking this through, and unfortunately, they're not listening to our proportionate suggestions. Now, where else could they? Any local authority could put a control zone. East Neuk of Fife, they probably do something. Skye might do something. We just don't know, and that's the problem. And this is the problem with local authorities. You know, they've got an awful lot to do, an awful lot to think about. They've got an awful lot of ways of getting it wrong. Jo, would you have anything else to say on that?
No, not really. I think the control zones are an issue. I mean, I've been on a call, I'm on the Law Society Licensing Committee, so we were on a call with the Scottish Government and some clerks from boards, and some of the clerks were saying, we don't anticipate bringing that in. And some of the clerks were actually saying, we don't anticipate having an issue setting the scheme up and having it operational within a year. But that's in a mixture of urban and rural boards, that the clerks are saying that Glasgow and Edinburgh are just shrugging their shoulders and shaking their heads. So in terms of the control areas, I think you'll see a really big difference across the country. Edinburgh, there's obviously a focus here. That's why this has come about. I don't think that can be argued. There's a focus here for the issues they're encountering, but there's different issues encountered all over. So my only concern is that the control areas are not abused, as in planning don't put them in to try to achieve things they should be achieving through the planning legislation and not through this legislation. But we can only really wait and see what happens and then try and challenge them at the time.
And I think that leads us on to a question from David. There have been several recent very stirring meetings with Andrew Mott and the delivery group. Scottish Government has been told in no uncertain terms why this is disproportionate and unfair. Is there really no chance of derailing this? And why is Scottish Government not adopting ASSC suggestions? Well, that's a very good question. They damn well should be. We can only try. We can only do our best. And that is why you are all on this call. You know, we need to give our reasons why a different option is better. We do apparently live in a democracy. The people in the Scottish Government represent us. We are constituents, as well as the vocal minority that don't like short-term lets in Edinburgh. We need to get our voices heard, and that is the purpose of this call.
The problem you have, David, is that the last consultation was about the option. This consultation was very clearly about the licensing scheme. So this consultation is on the basis of the done deal. The issue with the BRIA, the Business Regulation Impact Assessment, is that they said they produced one last time. Now, there's a discussion to be had on whether you seek to challenge that, because one of the issues in the BRIA is it an alternative to legislation, and if so, what is that, and is it viable? And that's one of the things that we need to introduce to the submission response, or sorry, the consultation submission, is that there is, and it is viable, and it needs to be done. The issue is that it does come across very much as a done deal. And even regardless of that, if the Scottish Government either say, we did a BRIA last time, they have got the opportunity to say, as we've done one, there is no need for us to do a second one. If they can justify why a BRIA is not required in terms of legislative process and consultation process, they are allowed not to produce one, but they have to justify why it's not required. So the Minister who is submitting has a final sign-off on the draft legislation, must at that point ask his team why there's no BRIA and what the justification is, and he has to sign off on that. He will then be asked by the government, why is there no BRIA, and he has to then explain that. But the fact is that their position is, we did one last time, we don't need to do another one. So whether or not that stands up is a question, but I would anticipate it probably will, which is unfortunate because I don't think the same questions were asked last time, and that's an issue.
They weren't, they simply weren't. I mean, it was a completely ridiculous consultation. It wasn't a consultation, it was entirely led. And we formally complained to the Scottish Government about it. And I think, you know, the other issue is they haven't produced a BRIA, and Andrew Mott said the other day repeatedly that they will be producing one. But if you are going to be producing one, it should have been produced at the same time as the consultation, so that we as impacted businesses will be able to make an informed decision based on that BRIA. The other thing that they haven't done, and is another thing that we will be pulling them up on, my dad's a barrister too, I've kind of got a little bit of a, you know, is they haven't done any kind of impact assessment on the as per the Islands Act. Mm-hmm. And given that I already pulled them up on that in terms of the grant eligibility criteria back in spring, summer, they should know that I'm going to come after them on that one. So, you know, we've got little things that we can play, little cards that we can play. And that's where wonderful Joanna Millar's coming into this.
A couple of other questions that we've had on fees and licensing fees and justification of charging licensing fees. So obviously at the moment, people on the small business bonus scheme and non-domestic rates won't pay any rates. But so how are they justifying paying a licensing scheme, and is there any indication of what that money will be spent on by the local authorities?
Yeah, it's self-funding, so they do have to be transparent, and the licensing legislation requires licensing board departments to produce accounts at the end of the year to show where the money has gone. The cost is, it's based on self-funding, so what they have to do is they have to section off their licensing system, and they have to work out how much it's going to cost them to do a new application and how much it's going to cost them to do a renewal. And that cost is everything. So it's just like running a business. It's everything from your consumables to your staff to your share of heat and light and building. It literally is to try to make it self-funding. And I think we'll see more and more of this in legislation and certainly in licensing, where they can attempt to make it self-funding. And there are fees that have to be paid. The £1,000, I think, is probably a bit misleading because we really don't know. It could be £300, it could be £500, it could be based on your rates, it could be as liquor is, which is that you're divided up from 11,000 up, it goes into tranches. If you're below 11,500 or you're a visitor centre or you're a charity, then you only pay £200. But there is no exemption for people who are on the small business scheme in liquor, and I wouldn't expect that to be an exemption here. I think they will look at the bands, so they'll look at your rateable value, or they'll look at your council tax band. They won't look at what other benefits you get, whether you get a reduction because you've got 2 adults in full-time education, or you're a single person or whatever. They're just going to look at the basic bands. So in terms of £1,000, it could be an overstatement. The initial feeling was to compare this to HMO licenses, and I don't think that's accurate because HMO licensing is costed on a completely different basis. So I think we need to dial that back to look back at licensing, both liquor and general, and see how that goes. And as I said, the self-funding really is that. It's funding the licensing department and the section of the department that is going to deal with these applications.
There's an interesting, Mel, there's an interesting question from Emma who's talking about mandatory health and safety. And Emma, you're absolutely right. I think everybody on this call will be complying with all the health and safety, electrical safety, paying the right taxes, etc., etc. One of the policy objectives of this legislation is to make sure that everybody does that. Now, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve is to get amateur hosts to the same level playing fields in terms of health and safety and indeed paying tax. Now, I've been saying since 2016 that there's a very easy way of doing it. It's called communication and education. What we need is the platforms, the major platforms, be telling their hosts what they need to comply with. We already have a regulatory framework for professional self-caterers that ensures that our guests are safe. So all we need to do is transfer those exact same regulations over to amateur players. But they've decided not to do that. And I think that also relates to another question, why I'm talking about professional and non-professional. This is really aimed at, in the words of Andrew Mott, a significant minority of bad operators. He's not trying to legislate against us, but we're the ones that are going to be impacted by it.
Yes, on Emma's comment just about the electrical safety, etc. I think the issue here is that because people are letting through the likes of Airbnb and they're letting a room in their flat because they've got a spare room, but they're not letting it on a long term, they're letting it on a short term let, then that's why everybody isn't tested to the same standard. So that's the problem, and that's one of the things that they are, I suppose, trying to address. But as ASSC have said, that could be addressed on the basis of a regulation and not on the basis of a licensing scheme. Do you want me just to go through these? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, and I think what we might need to do, because there's quite a lot of questions, what we might need to do is respond to the questions and publish them on the website. Would that be?
Yeah, I think what we can do is we can.
Now, if you want me to.
Yeah, please do.
So only given 4 weeks consultation, there's not a restrictive consultation period. Their basis for 4 weeks is COVID-19, the fact they have to lay it by December, and the fact that they did a consultation already. So their justification for 4 weeks is founded in all of that. Then John Kerr says about moving longer short-term lets onto Scottish private residential tenancy. So you do not require a licence if you are only going to do long-term lets, but this is the difficulty with the definition of short-term let. So it should sit in conjunction with other pieces of legislation. That's what we're trying to get the Scottish Government drafting team to realise. You'd think the drafting team would be full of lawyers, because clearly they're drafting legislation. Sadly, it's not. So what we're trying to do is point them in the direction of, there is other pieces of legislation that run alongside this. You need to make sure your definition sits within them. This is what we had to do when we were consulting on the liquor licensing, and it's clearly what we're going to have to do again. So you shouldn't need a licence unless you are going between longer term lets, so over the 31 days, or short term lets definition. If you're going to do both, then you will need a licence. Somebody asked if it was based on the number of bookings or the annual fee. I appreciate that some of you are council tax and not non-domestic rates because you have restricted bookings. It's something we need to think about putting to the Scottish Government in the response, that if somebody keeps their bookings below a certain number, then they maybe pay a restricted application fee and a restricted renewal fee. But they would have to then have, that would have to be evidence-based, and they would maybe have a restricted licence in that case, that they can only have so many nights. That means there's an issue if you want to then increase that. It means you have to be very tight on your bookings, but maybe that's not an issue for those of you who do restrict it. It also means you have to then consider, if you want to increase it, you have to do a variation to your licence. So it is worthwhile, because I know the numbering is already a consideration for short-term lets, but it is a consideration you can put to them. If you've been operating for 10 years already, why would your planning not be granted automatically? Yes. That was raised on the Law Society call, where one of the solicitors, who is an expert in planning, said if you've already been operating for 10 years, it would be a certificate of lawful use, which elicited completely blank responses from the Scottish Government team. So again, that's something that we need to raise with them, is that the proper planning consideration is a certificate of lawful use, and that does not require to be renewed every 10 years. So they need to take a really close look at what they're proposing for planning in this case. Mortgages, admittedly something I hadn't thought about. So yes, put that into your submissions if you're going to do a response yourself. If that is something that makes it onerous, then if there aren't enough providers, and that if it's really difficult and it's going to cause an issue for you in your domestic mortgage or the current mortgage you have, you know, put that into the consultation, because that's things they will not have thought about. Maximum occupancy is probably going to be determined very much like hotels are determined at the moment. So if you have a hotel room, then your maximum occupancy is determined by building control, and it's determined not only by the number of beds, but on the space and how you fit those beds in. So there are minimum space requirements, and building control will most likely be involved in determining that. They will be what we call a statutory consultee. So when a new application comes in, it will be circulated to certain departments in the council, and building control are likely to be one of them. They'll come back and they'll then say, you can have X number of people. It will also be considered in accordance with the space available for things like cooking and washing, but because it's not a long-term let, I think that's going to be less of a consideration. Space in bedrooms is probably, the sleeping accommodation is going to be a consideration. Sanitary facilities will also be a consideration, less so for small lets, but more if you've got a big house that you let out for 30 people, then the number of sanitary facilities will be a consideration for that also, and we'll have to see if they are going to calculate that on the basis they currently calculate, for example, restaurant capacities or hotel capacities, or how they're going to do that. But again, we're just going to have to wait and see. Specifics. Yeah, in terms of the procedure, I can outline that, and I can also outline the current procedures in the 1982 Act for applications. So somebody's asked about the way that the legislation comes in. So I can give you an outline of the timescales, and I can also confirm that the 82 Act has current provisions in place for applications and objections and things.
And I guess, Fiona, that's the timescales are a key issue, because we've had people mentioning before, obviously when you've got bookings that are potentially a year in advance, that's kind of having implications on, you know, people's booking systems and things.
Well, it's certainly disadvantaging us against any other self-caterer across the whole of the UK, because if we're suddenly concerned that we might not get our license for some reason, or there might be a planning issue, then how on earth are you meant to mitigate against that in terms of taking bookings? You know, it's really worrying.
Yeah, I think you need to go on the basis that until you know there's an issue. I mean, I suppose that's another thing. Fiona and I were talking about terms and conditions, and I suppose that's another reason to look at terms and conditions to make sure that I know most of you have refunded completely to people who have been affected by COVID-19. So if regulations have come in, or somebody's not been well and they've not been able to come, then most of the self-catering are saying, you know, we'll give you a refund, or you can rearrange it to another time, which is incredibly fair. But I suppose it's just looking then at what you do to protect yourselves and your terms and conditions if there's a problem with your licence. And that's maybe something that you need to think about, because it's something that you would find if you were to book a function or a wedding. Then there'll be a cancellation provision in there, that there'll be a what we call force majeure, which is matters out with your control. There will then now be a coronavirus term and condition, but there'll also be one which will be, if there's a licensing issue, then we can't do it, and we'll try to accommodate you if they've got more than one area, or you know, they'll suggest other places. And usually in that case, there is a necessity on the venue to refund deposits completely. But as you've pretty much all been doing that, I'm not sure that that's too onerous. It's just making sure there's no obligation in you to accommodate when you actually can't in terms of a license. HMO licensed premises, which tenancy agreements tend to have that in as a clause in the tenancy agreement as well. So it's maybe something to think about in terms of reviewing terms and conditions. Peter wants to know if we should think about judicial review. Maybe, but it's very expensive. I think what we need to think about first is this BRIA issue, and just see if we can get in before that. There was talk of there will be one produced and it will go in with the SSI. I think we need to make it clear to them if they're going to produce it, we need to see it first. I'm not sure how successful we're going to be with that, but if we're going to consider judicial challenge, I think that's probably the place for that challenge. It's a place that will be most effective, because the rest of it, you would need to have a basis, and although that's been a short consultation period and so on and so forth, there is justification for that, and I don't think the courts would side with anyone trying to challenge that. But I think the BRIA is a big issue. Potential changes to business rates, values. As far as I'm aware, small bonus relief won't change, but as I said, I don't think it will have an impact on your fees. It will only impact on you if it changes the, if you can benefit from it, for example, with your premises. Change of usage due to planning on the title deeds, which does not currently exist, will involve expensive legal fees and remortgaging. Yeah, I think your issue here is that what they may do with planning is, if you have a restaurant or a cafe, that's class 3 food and drink for planning. If you have a public house, it falls within what we call sui generis. So it's a Latin term, and it's sui generis, and it's basically a catch-all. What they may do is put you into the sui generis. So you need to apply for planning permission, and anything which doesn't fall nicely into one of the categories becomes sui generis. So that may be what you find will be an issue. You shouldn't need to change your title deeds in terms of planning. There is a description that can be changed when it's sold, as long as when you have, if you decide to sell property or if you're buying property, then you ensure that you see the planning permissions and you ensure that they have either got planning permission in place or haven't needed it. So shouldn't be too bad, but I think the mortgage consideration again is coming up, and that's obviously something which is a consideration, and you should definitely put in, because it's something I didn't think about, and it's probably something the Scottish Government won't think about. David Smythe, parliamentary time is tight ahead of the election in May, no chance of raising so many objections. I know it seems difficult, but we are working really hard. Fiona's already worked really hard with the ASSC team, and they've got put together an excellent response, and I'll do the technical bits over the next day or so. So Fiona can have a look through that before we submit it on Friday. There was also a letter which Fiona had written suggesting that we delay the procedure. So the Scottish Government, in its wisdom, completely misinterpreted this as we want to put in a late submission. No, we just don't want you to do licensing at all, if that was possible. But they've come back and said, oh yes, you can put it in late. So it gives us a little bit of breathing space in that we can get in what we're going to get in for Friday. And if there are any issues arise between now and then, or if we decide, if the ASSC decide we do want to take the BRIA matter forward, then it gives us another couple of weeks where the ASSC as a whole could put something in late. It doesn't give any of you, unfortunately, the right to put it in late. You guys do need to get on the website and get that in by Friday. But if there are bigger issues that someone comes and says to us after that, we've not put this in and this is a really massive issue and it's not been thought about, then it gives us the opportunity to, they did say nothing new, but I'm sure we could slot it into a heading. So it just gives us a little bit of breathing space.
Andrew will perfectly expect me to just hound him until December. It's fine. I think we should probably try and wrap up, but anything that we haven't answered, we will try and answer. And this video will be put on the ASSC website as well. And we will also be providing some bullet points that you might want to raise with your MSPs. And we can also share the correct email addresses for the people that you need to write to, because you need to write to them. If it's not your MSP, you need to write to them in their capacity as cabinet ministers. Jo, thank you so much for your time and all for the support that you're giving us in this matter. We are really being incredibly well supported by Jo and also our incredible PR and public affairs team over at Halogen, who are giving us invaluable support. So please, my last plea is please respond to the consultation and also write your MSP and tell your neighbours and tell your friends and make sure as many people do it as possible. And thank you so much, and we will continue to do what we're doing. Thanks very much.
We'll add bits on the news page and updates and things this week leading up to it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.